The mountain does not care who is left on it, and that is the first thing to understand about her. It stands in the middle of the southern peninsula, in the region the Greeks called the Bear Country, and it is high. High enough that the snow sits in the north-facing gullies into June, and that the pines give out near the top and leave nothing but gray rock and wind. From the summit ridge on a clear day, you can see water on two sides, though it takes most of a day to get up there and you would not want to be caught on it after dark. It has a temper. Cloud builds on it in the afternoon out of a clear morning. There are ravines on the western flank, so steep and so wooded that nobody goes into them, and springs that come out of the rock ice cold in the middle of August, and stretches of open upland where the grass is cropped short by animals, and there is nothing else at all. No wall, no track, no smoke. Wolves lived here. Bears lived here. Both of them still did within living memory in that part of the world, and one of them still does. This is a place where things are left. That is not a figure of speech. In the world we are going to spend tonight in, a family that could not keep a child, because there were too many, or the harvest had failed, or the child was the wrong sex, or came at the wrong time, did not usually kill it. They carried it up somewhere like this, and put it down and walked away, and what happened next was left to the gods, and the gods were understood to have opinions. Come up the track with a man who is doing exactly that. It is early. The light is gray and flat, and there is dew on everything, and the track under his feet is the kind that is only a track because animals use it. The pines start smelling of themselves as the sun gets at them, that hot resin smell, which is one of the smells of tonight. So let it in now. He is carrying a bundle, and he is not looking at it. Higher up, past the last of the trees, there is a clearing with a spring in it, and he puts the bundle down there in the grass and stands for a moment. Then he goes back down the mountain, and that is the last we see of him for 20 years. Let yourself settle wherever you are lying. Nothing happens to the child. I will tell you that straight away, because it is a strange kind of cruelty to leave a listener holding that while they are trying to fall asleep, and because the whole point of this story is what happened instead. She lives. She lives for a very long time, and she becomes the fastest person in Greece, and she is at the center of the biggest hunt that country ever remembered. And she loses one race on purpose, or by accident, and nobody has ever agreed which. If these long nights are useful to you, Aeol-like is what lets this quiet channel reach other people awake at this hour, and I like knowing who is listening. Leave your town and the time on your clock in the comments before you drift off, and I will read them in the morning with the coffee. The practice had a name and it had rules, and knowing them changes how the opening scene reads. The word for it means, roughly, a putting out, and it was not the same thing as killing, in the way that world thought about it. That distinction mattered enormously, and it was maintained with a care that looks like self-deception to us, and probably was. The child was not harmed. The child was placed somewhere, at a crossroads, on a hillside, at the gate of a sanctuary, sometimes in a pot, and placing it there transferred the decision to somebody else, to whoever passed by, to the animals, to the gods. So a family could tell itself it had not done the thing it had done. We know it happened because it shows up everywhere, in the law codes, in the comedies, in private letters. There is a famous and horrible papyrus letter from Egypt. A man writing home to his pregnant wife, affectionate and chatty about ordinary business, who adds almost in passing that if the child is a boy, she should keep it, and if it is a girl, she should put it out. That letter is quoted in every textbook on the subject, and it is quoted because of the tone. It is not a monster writing. It is somebody's husband being practical. How common it actually was, historians disagree about sharply, and the honest answer is that nobody can count something nobody recorded. Some argue the myths and the comedies exaggerate a rare emergency measure into a commonplace. Others point to the sex ratios in certain census documents and think otherwise. What is not in dispute is that the stories are full of it. Nearly every major exposed child myth ends the same way. The child lives, is raised by animals or by shepherds, and comes back. The founders of Rome, suckled by a wolf. the king of Thebes, who solved the riddle, pinned through the ankles, and left on a mountain. The boy in the reeds, who fought the boar in an earlier story of ours. The child of Persia's founding legend, raised by a herdsman. It is one of the most widespread plots there is, and the reason is not hard to find. A culture that does a thing it cannot admit to will tell itself stories in which the thing turns out all right. Now, why was she left? Her father wanted a son, that is all. There is no oracle, no curse, no prophecy about the child destroying the city, which makes this story unusual because there is nearly always a prophecy. There is only a man in a hill kingdom who had a daughter first and did not want one, and who dealt with it the way it was dealt with. And here is where the story does something that I find almost unbearably neat. The goddess of that mountain took an interest. She is the one who runs. The virgin huntress, the one who will not marry, whose whole domain is the wild country outside the walls, the marshes and the ridges and the animals in them. And who is worshipped in that region more than anywhere else in Greece? She sent a bear, not a wolf, not a she-goat, not a shepherd's wife with a spare breast. A bear. And there is a reason for that, and the reason is not zoological. The bear was that goddess's animal, in a way that is easy to say and takes a while to feel. There was a sanctuary of hers at a place called Brauron on the east coast of Attica, on a marshy stretch near the sea. It was one of the most important shrines in the whole region, and what happened there was this. Girls, small ones, somewhere between 5 and 10 years old, were sent to serve the goddess for a season. They were called the bears. That is the actual word. The little girls at that sanctuary were the arktoi, the she-bears, and they wore a saffron-colored robe, and there was a ritual in which they took it off, and there were races. We know a great deal about this because of the pottery. There are hundreds of small vessels found at that site, made specially for the sanctuary, and painted on them are little girls, running, holding wreaths and torches, walking in procession, standing beside an altar. Some of them are running with their arms out. Some of them are being led by a woman. On one, there is a figure in a bear mask. Why bears? Scholars remain divided, and the ancient explanation is a story about a tame bear kept at the sanctuary that scratched a girl, and the girl's brothers killed it, and a plague followed, and the goddess demanded that girls thereafter play the bear in recompense. Whether anybody believed that literally is another question. What the ritual clearly did was mark a passage. A girl went out of her father's house to a wild place at the edge of the territory, spent a season being an animal, and came back ready to be a woman of the city, which is precisely the shape of the story we are following, except that in her case, nobody came to collect her. So, hold that when you picture what happens next. A little girl on a mountain being brought up by a bear is not an oddity in that culture. It is the standard metaphor for what every girl in Attica was believed to go through, taken literally, and left running. Now come back to the clearing, because there is something to see. The bear comes at dusk on the second day. Brown bears in Greece are not the enormous northern kind. They are perhaps 2 meters from nose to tail, heavy in the shoulder, with a dish-shaped face and small eyes, and a nose that does everything for them. A sense of smell so good that it is estimated to be several times better than a bloodhound's, which is difficult to imagine and largely the point. She has cubs somewhere in the rocks above, which is why she is producing milk, and which is also why she should be the last animal on this mountain to go near a strange thing that smells of humans. She comes out of the trees and stops. She stands up, which bears do to see and to smell rather than to threaten, and the wind carries what it carries. And then she does what the story requires, and I am not going to pretend I can explain it, and neither could the Greeks. They simply said the goddess sent her. She takes the bundle in her mouth by the wrapping, the way she carries a cub, and goes back up the slope with it. Live in the den for a moment, because we do not get scenes like this often. It is a hollow under a slab of rock, with a drift of dry pine needles and old leaves in the bottom, and it smells of animal. A heavy, warm, slightly sour smell that is not unpleasant once you have been in it for an hour, and that a child raised in it would never afterwards be able to name because it would simply smell like home. It is dark, and it is warmer than outside by a great deal. And there is a sound in it that goes on all night, the enormous, slow breathing of something asleep, and the higher, faster breathing of the cubs against it. She grows up in that. Later poets added a great deal to this. One Roman writer has her nursed and then found and raised by hunters. Another has the goddess herself involved more directly. But the core is always the same, exposed, suckled by a bear, and then taken in by people who lived on the mountain. Hunters found her in most tellings. Not a family. A group of men who lived up there working the high country, who found a small child among animals and took her in and raised her the only way they knew how, which was to teach her everything they did. That is her education. Not weaving, not the loom, not the household, which is what every other girl in that world learns from the age of 5. Tracking, snaring, the bow, skinning, where the springs are. How the wind moves in a valley in the morning and in the evening, which is different and matters. And running. Because on a mountain, running is not sport. It is how you get to the other side of a ridge before an animal does, and how you keep up with dogs, and how you get down to the tree line before the cloud comes in. She turns out to be extraordinary at it. The poem fragments and the handbooks all say the same thing in different words. Swift-footed, fastest of mortals, no man could catch her. And that gift, which starts as a practical skill for a girl living rough, becomes the thing that shapes every single event of her adult life, including how she is nearly killed, and how she is married, and how she stops being human at the end. She grows up wild, and then, at some point, the world finds her. Before we leave the mountain, a word about the goddess she grew up under, because everything she becomes is shaped by it. She is the twin sister of the god of prophecy and music, born on a small island, and she asked her father for a set of things while she was still a child. A bow, a short tunic that came to the knee, 60 ocean nymphs for companions, all the mountains in the world, and above everything else, to never be married. He gave her all of it. That is the standard picture. The huntress, the one who runs with dogs on the ridges, the goddess of the country outside the walls. But she was also, and this confuses everybody who meets it for the first time, the goddess women prayed to in childbirth, the same figure, the virgin who will not marry, and the one whose name you called when the labor started. There are dedications from all over Greece, clothing, belts, offerings left by women who had survived a birth, and by women who had not been so lucky, whose garments were dedicated after their deaths. Some scholars read that as a single coherent idea rather than a contradiction. That she is the goddess of every threshold a woman crosses, and that her business is the dangerous passages. From girl to woman, from woman to mother, rather than the settled state on either side. She stands at the boundary, not in the house, and not entirely in the wild, but at the exact line between them, in the marshes and the scrub at the edge of the cultivated land. And she does not forgive much. There was a hunter who saw her bathing and was turned into a stag and torn apart by his own dogs. There was a companion of hers who was seduced by the king of the gods and got pregnant, and who was thrown out of the band for it, and who was turned into a bear. That is worth pausing on. The most famous transformation in that goddess's whole cycle is a young woman being turned into a bear, and afterwards being placed in the sky as the constellation that never sets. So when a bear is sent to a mountain to feed an abandoned girl, the Greek listening already had a set of associations stacked up behind the animal. The goddess's own follower, punished and transformed, and hanging in the north sky over the whole story. There is an episode before the famous one, and it is short, and it tells you what she was like. 2 centaurs came at her in the woods. They are the mountain people of Greek myth, horse-bodied, hard-drinking, and famous for ruining a wedding by trying to carry off the bride, which is more or less their entire reputation. 2 of them found her alone on a forest track. She had a bow. That is the whole story. She shot both of them before they reached her, and the sources give their names, and one of them was famous enough to be a character elsewhere. I mention it because it is easy to picture her as a girl in a woodland idyll, and the poems do not. She is a working hunter carrying a weapon she can use in a place where being alone is genuinely dangerous, and she has been dealing with that since she was old enough to draw. Now, north. Across the Gulf, on the other side of central Greece, in a country of vines and orchards, a king made a mistake with his harvest offerings. He sacrificed to everybody, the whole list, in order, the way you should, and left one out. Some say by accident, some say he simply forgot her, and the poem that tells it best says he either forgot or was careless, and that it was a great blindness of the mind. The one he left out was the goddess of the wild, and what she sent was a boar. This is a different animal from the one in the hunting stories. It is enormous. The old poem calls it a wild boar with white tusks, a savage thing, and describes what it did. It ruined the orchards, tore the trees out by the roots, brought down the apple blossom, went through the vines and the standing corn. Later writers make it bigger and worse, bigger than a bull, with eyes full of fire and bristles standing like spear points, and a hide nothing could get through. The whole country stopped working. That is what it means. In a farming economy, an animal that destroys the orchards and the crops is not a monster in the fairy tale sense. It is a famine walking about on 4 legs. So the king's son sent out word, and here is the thing that made this story enormous for the Greeks. Everyone came. The hunt for that boar is one of the great gatherings of Greek legend, the equivalent of the expedition after the fleece and the army that went to Troy. And the reason it mattered so much is that the list of names is a who's who of an entire generation, fathers of Trojan War heroes. The strong man himself in some versions. The pair of twins from Sparta who became the constellation, the man who would later kill the Minotaur. 2 uncles of the boy who would grow up to be the cleverest man in Greece. Every noble house in the country sent somebody, and the names were remembered, and the guest list varies from source to source in exactly the way you would expect when a dozen cities all want their ancestor to have been there. And one woman came. She came over from the mountain in the south on her own, and the description we have of her arrival is from a Roman poet several centuries later. And it is very good, and it is worth hearing, because it is the only physical description of her anybody bothered to write down. Her dress was fastened at the neck with a single smooth brooch. Her hair was gathered into one simple knot, with nothing else in it. From her left shoulder hung the ivory quiver, and the arrows rattled in it as she moved, and she had the bow in her left hand. And then he says, her face was such that you would call it girlish for a boy, or boyish for a girl. That last line has been chewed over for a very long time, and it is doing something more than describing a face. She is standing in a field with 50 aristocratic hunters who have never in their lives been in a wood with a woman who is not there to carry something. Some of them refuse to hunt with her. That is in the sources, and it is stated plainly. Several of the men objected to a woman joining, and there was an argument. And it took the king's son to override them, because he had looked at her once, and that was that. His name was Meleager, and he was the prince of that country, and he was married, and he was doomed in a way we will come to, and from the moment she walked into that camp, he was finished. Now the hunt, and I am going to take it slowly because a hunt at dawn in a wood is one of the best things there is to fall asleep to. They go out before the light, and the dogs go first. There are a great many dogs. Greek hunting hounds were a real and specific thing. There is a whole surviving manual about them, written by a soldier and gentleman farmer a few centuries after this story was already old. And it is a wonderful book, full of advice about how to name a hound. Short names, 2 syllables, so you can call them quickly, and how to tell a good nose from a bad one, and how the tracking goes wrong when the dew has lifted. That book tells you that hares were tracked at dawn, precisely because the scent lies in the wet grass and burns off with the sun. So, dawn. The men are spread out in a line moving up through the trees, and the dogs are working ahead, and the ground is soaked. Feel the wood. It is the wet forest smell. Leaf mold turned over, cold underneath, and mushrooms somewhere, and the sharpness of crushed fern. Everything drips. The nets are being carried in bundles because they netted as much as they speared, and stakes to peg them out with. There is a marsh at the bottom of the slope, thick with willow and sedge and standing water. And that is where the animal is lying up. The dogs find it, and the note of them changes. Anyone who has been near working hounds knows that change, from casting about to certainty, and it goes through every man in the line at once. And there is an omen the poets kept, and it belongs here, in the last quiet minute before anything happens. The men had made their offerings before setting out. That is standard. And it is the whole reason there is a boar in this country in the first place, so nobody was going to repeat the king's mistake. But there was a bird. The accounts differ about what it was and what it did. In some, it is a heron going up off the marsh ahead of the line, which is an ordinary thing for a heron to do, and an entirely reasonable thing to read as a sign. In others, it is a bird flying across from left to right, which was the good direction, and a man says so out loud, and everybody is cheered. And in one telling, it flies the other way, and nobody mentions it. That is a small thing, and I like it very much, because it captures how omens actually worked. 50 men are standing in a wet wood before dawn with a dangerous job ahead of them, and something moves in the sky, and every single one of them decides privately what it meant, and only the ones who like the answer say anything. 2 of them will not walk out of this marsh, and neither of them is the one who is worried. And it comes out. I am going to keep this brief, because you are trying to sleep, and the details are ugly. It goes badly at first. Spears are thrown and miss, or glance off. 2 men are killed. One of the twins from Sparta is knocked flat. There is a stretch where 50 of the best hunters in Greece are getting nowhere against one animal in wet ground, where they cannot see it coming. And then, from the edge of the line, a woman looses an arrow. It goes in behind the ear. It is the first blood. The poem says the ground was reddened, and that she saw her own success before the men did, and that the prince shouted, actually shouted in front of everybody, that she would have the honor of the wound. The men, the poet notes, were ashamed. It takes several more spears, and the prince himself finishes it. But the first blood is hers, and in a hunt that mattered. And everybody there saw it. Stay in the wood a moment longer, because there is something about her weapon that is easy to walk past. She is the only one who brings a bow. Everybody else has a spear. That is what a Greek aristocrat hunted with. A heavy boar spear used close, with a crossbar below the head to stop the animal running up the shaft at you, which tells you everything about what these hunts were like. Going in with a spear is a matter of standing your ground while something very heavy comes at you. The bow is a different proposition, and in the heroic value system, it was slightly suspect. There is a whole undercurrent about it in the war poems. The great archer on the Trojan side is mocked for it, and a Greek who fights with a bow is insulted to his face as a man who hides behind a shield and shoots from a distance and would not stand up in the line. It is the weapon of somebody who cannot afford to be strong, and it is the correct weapon for her, and not only because she is smaller than everyone in that clearing. It is what you use when you hunt to eat, rather than to prove something. At range, at the first clear chance, before the animal knows you are there. She was not raised to fight a boar. She was raised to kill dinner from 40 paces, quietly, on her own, and to be right the first time because there is no second arrow when the animal is running, which is why, in a wood full of noblemen with spears getting nowhere, the first wound comes from the edge of the line. To ancient listeners, this meant something faintly awkward. The honor of the hunt going to the least honorable weapon, held by the person with the least right to be there. Now, the hide. The skin and the tusks were the trophy, and they belonged to whoever the leader gave them to, and the prince gave them to her. That is a public act, with a meaning that everybody present understood instantly. He is not being gallant. He is awarding the honor of the hunt to a woman who is not from that country in front of the assembled nobility of Greece, including his own uncles, and his uncles take it off her. They stop her on the way out of the wood, she was carrying it, and take it and say the thing that men in stories say, which is that she has no right to it, and that if the prince will not take it, then it belongs to the family by right of kin, and he kills them, both of them. His mother's brothers on the spot, in a rage, in the trees. Everything after that goes wrong in the way Greek stories go wrong, and it is not her story anymore, so let me give it to you briefly and gently, because it is one of the strangest and saddest things in the whole tradition. When the prince was a week old, the three fates came to his mother's room, and they said, "This child will live exactly as long as the log now burning on your hearth." And she got up and took it out of the fire and put it out and locked it in a chest. She had it for 20-odd years, and on the day her son killed her brothers, she took it out and put it back on the fire. The old poem says only that she called down curses on him and beat the ground with her hands, calling on the powers below to kill her son, and that the avenger who walks in the dark hurt her. Later, poets gave her the log and the scene, and it is the version that lasted, because it is unforgettable. A woman standing in front of a hearth with a piece of wood in her hands, doing the arithmetic. He died on the field, in agony, without a wound on him, while the wood burned through. And she killed herself when it was done, and his sisters wept until the gods turned them into birds, a species of guinea fowl, which the Greeks named for him, and whose speckled plumage they said was the tears. The tradition kept that connection. There was a shrine in that region, and travelers reported that the birds were kept there and fed by the priests. She walks out of that story alive with nothing, and she goes back south. That is the shape of the first half of her life. She wins the thing, and it is taken from her, and everybody around it destroys itself, and she goes home. There is a second adventure some sources give her, and I will mention it because of how it ends rather than what it is. She sailed. Several writers put her aboard the ship that went east after the Golden Fleece, the only woman among 50 men, in the way she was the only woman at the hunt. But the epic that tells that voyage in full leaves her out, and it explains why. It says the captain would not take her, though she asked, and though he wanted to, he was afraid of what would happen on a long voyage with 50 men and one woman, and he thought the quarrels would sink the expedition, which is a strikingly practical piece of reasoning to find in a poem about a magic ram's fleece. She turns up in the funeral games afterwards, though, in more than one account, wrestling and beating a man at it, and the man she beat was the father of the greatest fighter who ever lived. That detail traveled well. There are vase paintings of a wrestling match between a woman and a man, with the two of them gripped and braced and evenly matched, and the names painted beside their heads, and then her father sends for her. That is the turn, and it is the one that makes this story hurt in a way the boar never does, because he has heard about the hunt. Everybody has. The whole of Greece is talking about the woman from the mountain who drew first blood, and somewhere in a hill kingdom in the south, an old man works out who she must be, and he acknowledges her. He brings her into his house and gives her his name and treats her as his daughter, the daughter he carried up a mountain and put down in the grass and walked away from. Nobody in any surviving source has him apologize, not one line. He simply reclaims her, and she comes, and the sources move straight on to the next thing. That is the moment I would sit with longest if this were a novel. A woman in her 20s who was raised by animals and hunters, who owes this man nothing whatsoever, walking through the door of the house she should have grown up in. Why does she go? The sources do not say, and I think the honest answer is that there was nowhere else. She has no city and no household, and in that world, a person without either is not free. They are simply unprotected. Her father is offering her the only legal existence available to a woman in that culture, and there is no version of the story in which she refuses it. There is one detail in the reconciliation that is worth having, because it is the only tender thing in it. Some versions say she was recognized, not worked out from the reports of the hunt, but recognized by tokens. The things she had been wrapped in when she was carried up the mountain, kept by somebody, produced 20 years later. That is a stock device in Greek storytelling, and it turns up everywhere, especially on the comic stage, where the abandoned child and the little box of trinkets became such a standard that audiences groaned at it. But it survived as a device because it was doing something real. In a world with no records, Tokens were how a person could be reattached to a family. A ring, a piece of embroidery, a scrap of a distinctive weave. So there is a version of this in which an old man in a hill kingdom kept the blanket. He carried a child up a mountain and left her, and walked down, and then he kept the wrapping for 20 years, in a chest, in a house where he had no daughter. Nobody in the sources comments on that either. It is simply how she is identified, and the price of it arrives within about a week. He wants her to marry. Of course he does. That is what a daughter is for, in the economics of that world. A marriage is an alliance between houses, and a daughter is the thing that makes it, and a woman as famous as she now is would fetch a great deal. So, she does the only thing she can do, which is what her father did to her, in reverse. She sets a condition that looks like agreement. She says she will marry any man who can beat her in a foot race. And she adds the second half, and this is where the versions split badly. In most of them, anybody who runs and loses dies. Now, is that her cruelty or her father's? Some tellings put the death penalty in her mouth and make her ruthless. Others give it to the father who is running the contest and wants a filter that will produce a real champion. And one strand, which I find the most persuasive, says she was simply repeating the terms of a story she would have known, because foot race for a bride, with death for the losers, is a plot that already existed, and there was a famous king who did exactly that with chariots and nailed the heads of the losers to his door. Whichever it is, the terms are announced, and men come anyway. They came, the Roman poet says, in spite of the danger, because she was so beautiful. And he adds the detail that makes it real. They came because a man in love has no sense of proportion, and each one believed he would be the exception. She gave them a head start. She ran behind them, armed, and she caught them, every one. Let that sit for a second, because the physical fact of it is astonishing, and the poems dwell on it. The fastest people in the region, given a lead, running for their lives, and a woman with a spear coming up behind them and passing them. The Roman version has the line that always stops readers, which is what she thinks while running, that she began to wish, at some point during one of these races, that the man in front of her would win. And then a man came who did not run at all at first. He sat at the finish and watched a race and worked something out. His name is given two ways in the sources, and they are separate strands of the tradition, and there is no reconciling them. Some call him Hippomenes, some call him Melanion. They are almost certainly the same figure with a doubled name, and the versions differ in flavor. One is a young stranger from a rich family, the other, a man who has been following her about the mountains for months, uncomplaining, being useful, letting her get used to him. I like the second one, and the sources mostly went with the first. What they agree on is the method. He did not train. He knew he could not win. The poem says, he stood there watching the racing and said out loud, "Why am I even trying? This is not a contest." So he went and asked for help, and the help came from the goddess of desire, who has an interest in unmarried people and does not like this particular arrangement at all. She gave him 3 apples, golden ones, from a garden in the far west, where a tree of them grows and a serpent lies round the trunk. The same garden the strong man visited on his 11th labor. In some versions, the goddess picks them herself from a grove of hers on Cyprus, and the poem is careful to note that nobody was watching and that they were heavy for their size and that they shone. Then she told him what to do with them. The apples themselves deserve a moment because of where else they turn up. Golden apples appear 3 times in Greek myth, and they cause trouble every single time. They grow in a garden at the western edge of the world, tended by the daughters of evening and guarded by a serpent that never sleeps, and fetching them was one of the 12 labors. A task so remote that the strong man had to hold up the sky for a while as part of the arrangement. They were a wedding present. The tree was the earth's gift to the queen of the gods on her wedding day, which makes it the marriage fruit at the very top of the system, and one of them, inscribed with 2 words, was rolled across the floor of a wedding feast by a goddess who had not been invited and started a war that lasted 10 years, which is a night we have already spent together. So when a young man goes to the goddess of desire and comes back with 3 of them, An audience in that world was not thinking shiny object. They were thinking, this is the fruit that means marriage, and it has never once been handed to anybody without consequences. There is also a plainer possibility, and philologists have raised it more than once, that the Greek word covers a family of tree fruit, and that the original object may have been a quince, which was the bridal fruit, eaten by a bride before she went in to her husband. 3 quinces rolled across a running track is a less glamorous image and a much more pointed one. The course is a straight one, and the crowd is on both sides of it, and it is not a stadium. It is a stretch of open ground with a mark at the far end. Feel the moment before, because it is the best few seconds in the whole story. The ground is dry. There is dust on it, fine, that lifts when anybody moves and hangs at knee height and takes a while to settle again. It is hot. There is the smell of a great many people standing in the sun and of the dust, and somebody has been roasting meat because a crowd in that world always meant somebody selling food. He has the apples inside his tunic, and they are heavier than he would like. She is stripped for running, in the short tunic of a runner, and her hair is up. And they go. She lets him lead, because that is the arrangement, and then she comes. The poet describing this has a wonderful sense of the physics of it. He says that when she ran, you would have said her feet had wings, that she could have gone over the tops of the ears of standing corn without bending them, or across the sea without wetting her feet. And he says something about the crowd noise, which is that the shouting was for him, that everyone was calling out to him to go faster. Now, use everything you have. And then he notices her shadow arriving beside his own on the ground before she does. That is the detail. Not the sound of her feet, not a glimpse. Her shadow coming up level with his on the dust. So he throws the first apple out to the side and forward so that it rolls and catches the light. And she turns off the line and goes for it. Now why? This is the crux of the entire story, and it has been argued about since antiquity. Why on earth would the fastest runner in Greece, in a race she has to win, stop for a piece of fruit? The simplest reading, which is the one the ancient sources mostly take at face value, is that she was struck by the wonder of the thing. That a shining golden apple rolling across the ground in the middle of a race is so strange and so beautiful that she went to it before she thought about it. The cynical reading, which is very old, is that she was greedy. And this is the reading that got her into medieval moral literature, where she turns up as an example of a soul distracted from the race of life by worldly goods, with the apples labeled in the margins. And then there is the third reading, and once you have seen it, you cannot get rid of it. She wanted to lose. The Roman poet all but says so. He puts the thought in her head before the race even starts. She looks at this young man and wishes he would not run, and asks herself whether it is really marriage she wants or just not to be handed to somebody. And then he gives her the line about wishing to be beaten. On that reading, the apples are not a trick. They are permission. She has built a wall around herself out of a condition nobody can meet, because it was the only wall available. And she cannot take it down herself because she said it in public, and because her father is standing right there. And a young man throws her a way out that lets her keep her word and lose the race at the same time. She goes for the second one. He is ahead again and losing ground again, and she comes past him, actually past him, and he throws it further out this time into the rough at the edge of the course, and she swerves and picks it up and comes back and passes him again anyway, because she is that much faster. That is the thing the story insists on. 2 detours, and she is still winning. They are close to the mark now, and he throws the third one hardest, off to the side. And this is the one that costs her, because it goes furthest, and she has to go furthest for it, and she is carrying 2 already. Some tellings add the practical detail, and it is a good one. The third apple was heavy, and by the time she had it, she was carrying too much, and she could not run properly with her arms full. He crosses the mark first, and the crowd noise changes, and a man who has never been able to run in his life is standing at the end of a course with his hands on his knees, and somewhere behind him, A woman is walking in with 3 gold apples in her arms. The sources say she took it well. That is worth noting. There is no scene of fury, no attempt to break the terms, no appeal to her father. There's a line in one of the later poets, put in her mouth as she comes in, that goes roughly, "You have won, and I am glad, and I do not know whether I lost this or gave it away." That is probably an invention. It is too neat. But whoever wrote it had understood the story. There is a coda to the race that the sources give in passing, and it is the only glimpse we get of her afterwards. She had a son. His name was Parthenopaeus, which is built on the Greek word for a maiden, and it means something like the maiden's boy. And it is a name that tells you the circumstances were talked about. Some versions have him born after the marriage, and some have him earlier from an encounter she does not discuss, and one has her doing to him exactly what was done to her, leaving him on a mountain where he was found by shepherds. He grew up handsome and quick and joined the expedition of the 7 captains who marched against Thebes. And he was the youngest of them, and he was the one everybody liked. And he was killed at the wall, hit by a stone dropped from above. The tragedians made a good deal of him, a beautiful boy who should not have been there, whose mother was a huntress, killed by a rock thrown by somebody he never saw. That is not an unusual fate in these stories. What is unusual is the shape it makes with hers. Everything she is famous for is speed and distance and never being caught. And her son is killed at close range, standing still under a wall in the one kind of fighting where none of that helps at all. They were married, and by all accounts, they were happy, and then they were turned into lions. That is the ending, and it comes about because of a piece of divine bookkeeping that is entirely characteristic of that world. The young man forgot to thank the goddess. She had picked 3 golden apples for him with her own hands and told him how to use them and won him the only thing he wanted, and he went home and got married and never sacrificed to her, never poured anything out, never said a word. Ancient audiences would have felt the shape of that immediately. It is the same failure the king made with his harvest offerings before the boar came. In that world, forgetting to give thanks is not rudeness. It is the fundamental error, and it is always paid for. So on a journey, passing a sanctuary of the mother goddess in most versions, one of those old shrines cut into a hillside with a spring and a cave behind it, she put it into his mind to go in, and they went into a place they should not have gone into, and lay together there. And that is a violation of a sanctuary, which is one of the few things in Greek religion that is unambiguously and immediately punished. They came out as lions. The Greeks believed something about lions that is not true, and it is essential to the story. They believed lions could not mate with each other, that a lioness only ever mated with a leopard, and that a pair of lions could therefore never breed. So the punishment is precise, and it is cruel in a very specific way. 2 people who fought their way past every obstacle to be together are made into a pair of animals who will spend the rest of their lives beside each other and can never again be anything to each other. And then they were harnessed to the chariot of the goddess whose sanctuary they had entered. And you can see them there on the reliefs and the coins and the temple friezes all over Anatolia and Greece. A seated goddess with a lion on either side. Some traditions claim that is the last of them, and some say they were later released, and one late writer says nothing about lions at all and has them left to old age. The version with the lions is the one that stuck, and it stuck because of what a Greek listener heard in it, which is that she ended as an animal, which is where she started. Left on a mountain to be eaten by animals, raised by one, turned into one. That is the circle the whole story is drawn around, and everything in the middle, the hunt, the hide, the father, the apples, is the part where she is temporarily a person in the human world. And it does not last. And there is one more place she survives, which is the ground. There is a spring in Arcadia that the local people showed to travelers as hers, struck out of the rock, they said, when she was thirsty from hunting, and drove her spear into a cliff, and the water came. A travel writer of the 2nd century of our era went and looked at it and wrote it down with the flat matter-of-factness he uses for everything. And the place is still identifiable, and there is still water there. There was a racecourse shown as hers too in the same region, and a hill, and in another part of the country, a sanctuary where her image stood. That is how these figures actually lived for the people who told them. Not as characters in a book, as an explanation for why there is a spring on that particular cliff, and why the flat ground below the village has always been called what it is called. Somebody's grandfather pointed at the rock and said whose spear made the hole. And somebody's grandchild pointed at it 100 years later, and one afternoon, a man with a notebook came through and wrote it down. And that is the only reason we know. Now, before we let all of it go, there is a small question worth putting down. Was there a real Atalanta? No. But she is one of the very few figures in Greek myth about whom you can ask a more interesting version of that question. Was there anything real behind her? And the answer is yes, in a limited and rather wonderful way, because Greek women did run. At Olympia, the same sanctuary, the same valley, in a festival held separately from the men's games, there were foot races for girls, run in honor of the great goddess. A travel writer of the 2nd century saw them and described the arrangement. 3 age groups, running one after another, over a course shortened to about 5/6 of the men's stadium. They ran with their hair loose, in a short tunic that came to just above the knee and left the right shoulder bare. And the winners got an olive crown and a share of a cow sacrificed to the goddess, and, this is the part that gets me, the right to set up a painted portrait of themselves in the sanctuary. A woman's face, with her name under it, on the wall of one of the most important religious buildings in Greece, because she ran fast. Sparta was the other place. Girls there trained openly, running, wrestling, throwing the discus and the javelin, on the theory that strong women had strong children, and the rest of Greece found it either admirable or scandalous depending on who was writing. There is a famous small bronze in the British Museum of a Spartan girl, running up on her toes, in a short tunic with one shoulder bare, and she is about 6 inches high and about 2,500 years old, and she looks like she is about to leave the case. So the figure of a girl who could outrun men was not a fantasy dropped into a culture that had no place for it. It had a place in specific sanctuaries, at specific festivals for a few days a year, in a world that otherwise kept its women indoors. She is the mythological version of the exception that world allowed itself. There is one more thing about her, and it is a small textual oddity that turns out to be the key to everything. There are 2 of her. That is the plain state of the sources, and ancient writers noticed it and could not fix it. One tradition makes her from Arcadia in the Central Highlands, the daughter of a man called Iasos, raised by the bear, the huntress, the one who shoots centaurs and joins the boar hunt. The other makes her from Boeotia in the north, daughter of a man called Schoeneus, and hers is the story of the race and the apples. 2 women, 2 fathers, 2 regions, and a set of adventures that different writers distribute between them in different combinations. A handbook writer of the Roman period lays both out side by side and more or less shrugs. Others tried to merge them and produced the composite that everybody now knows, which is the one I have told you tonight. I do not think the seam is a problem. I think it is informative, because look at what the 2 halves are. One half is the wild girl, the mountain, the animals, the bow, the hunt, everything that happens outside the walls. The other half is the marriage plot, the father, the suitors, the condition, the race, the wedding, everything that happens inside them. 2 separate local stories from 2 regions about a girl who will not be married, and the tradition kept pulling them toward each other for centuries until they fused, because the pattern underneath them is the same pattern, and it is the pattern that culture was most anxious about. A girl who does not want to leave the wild for the house. That is what the little bears at Brauron were rehearsing. That is what a season at a sanctuary on a marsh was for. To take a girl out of the world where she can run, mark the passage, and bring her back ready to be married. The myth is the same transition with the volume turned all the way up, told about somebody who fights it, and who is finally caught only by a trick, and who ends up outside the walls again anyway, on 4 feet, pulling a chariot. The Greeks told this story over and over because it was about the one thing that happened to every single girl they knew. Which brings me to the thread that has been running through all of tonight, and I will say it and then let it go. She spends her whole life being wanted by people who want something else. Her father wanted a son and got her. Her father, 20 years later, wanted a famous daughter to marry off and got her back. The prince at the hunt wanted her, and it destroyed his family. The men in the races wanted her enough to run at a spear, and the young man with the apples wanted her enough to ask a goddess for help. Nobody in the whole story asks her what she wants at any point, except possibly in one line that a Roman poet invented 400 years later, in which she wonders about it herself while running. And what she seems to want, as far as the story lets us see it, is very simple and completely unavailable: to be left where she was. Not on the hillside as a baby, on the mountain, as she was at 20, with the dogs and the bow and the springs and the cold and nobody's household to run. Come back there now, and we will finish where the mountain is. It is night on the high ground. The hunters' fires are out. The dogs are curled nose to tail in the lee of a rock, and one of them is running in its sleep and making small sounds. The wind has died at this hour, the way it does on a mountain between the day breeze and the night one. And there is a stretch of complete stillness in which the only thing you can hear is the spring coming out of the rock into the basin. Somebody hollowed out below it, going over and over unhurried. The pines have cooled and stopped smelling of resin and started smelling of the ground instead. Needles and damp and stone. Somewhere above the tree line, there is a hollow under a slab with old leaves in it. And it is empty now, and it has been empty for years, and the dry leaves are still in the bottom of it, exactly as they were. Above all of it, the sky is enormous, because there is no light for a very long way in any direction. The bear is turning in the north, where it always is, low and steady, never going down into the water. Somebody once said that Constellation was a girl too, taken up out of a story that ended badly, and put where she could not be caught. There is no race tonight. Nobody is coming up the track. Nothing is being taken away from anybody, and nothing needs to be won. You do not have to be fast. You do not have to be first. There is no condition to meet, and no one at the finish waiting to see how you did. Let your hands open. Let the whole day go out of your shoulders and down into the bed. Let the breath slow, and let the next one arrive without being sent for. Sleep well.